Welcome to the Red Review. My name is Daniel. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming to you from Takaranto, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River.
Hey, my name is Emily Steers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, and Haudenosaunee peoples, also known as Guelph, Ontario.
The Red Review is brought to you by Socialist Action. All the people that work on this podcast live and work on Turtle Island, stolen Indigenous land. We demand self-determination for Indigenous peoples. We demand restitution before reconciliation, and we demand land back. Today, we interview Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and Emily and I were stoked to have this opportunity. Jessica just published Fresh Banana Leaves, a book on what Indigenous science is to her, and introduces us to concepts like eco-colonialism to really frame how capitalism has disproportionately impacted Indigenous communities and Black communities. The book then lays out a basis for settlers and Indigenous peoples to unite around our common struggles and what it requires for that to be possible. So we really hope you enjoy this conversation we had.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Red Review, a Socialist Action podcast. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Jessica Hernandez. Jessica is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to forestry. Her work is grounded in her Indigenous cultural ways of knowing. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. She's the founder of Piña Sol, SPC, an environmental consulting and artisanas hybrid business that supports Black and Indigenous-led conservation and environmental projects through community mutual aids and microgrants. All right, so welcome, Dr. Jessica Hernandez.
Buen día. Thank you for having me here today.
So that is your professional bio, but can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your practice?
Yeah, so it's a hard question, right, when you're asked to talk about yourself. But I guess I am a young Indigenous woman who, had the privilege to pursue higher academia, especially in the environmental sciences. I come from the Maya Chorti community, which is located in El Salvador, and also the Zapotec Biniza community that's located in Oaxaca, Mexico. Both of my parents were displaced because of my dad's involvement or, forced involvement in the Central American Civil War. Eventually, he made his journey to Oaxaca, where he met my mother. And, as a result of the United States providing them with refuge and asylum, he, came with my mother to the United States. And I have been living here throughout my entire life because I was born in South Central Los Angeles, California.
Thank you for providing a bit more of the personal background, because the book is wonderful in how it integrates that. And you make a point at some point in the book further on that outside of books, you don't have the opportunity to actually integrate personal with the academic. And as someone who also comes from a sciences background, I also share that criticism that it often becomes so formal. So my first question, just to get at this idea, you describe yourself as an Indigenous scientist. What does that mean to you? And why do you use this description instead of other descriptions used like traditional knowledge or cultural knowledge?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I use the word or the term Indigenous science is just because, being trained in, formally and you probably can relate to this, Daniel, where we're trained in the environmental sciences. We are taught that, the only knowledge that's validated is like a knowledge that goes through the scientific method, right? Where we formulate a hypothesis, where, we make an observation, eventually collecting data. And when we talk about that data, is numerical data. But when I look at the upbringing and the knowledge that has been passed down to me, even from my father, that was passed down through his father, through the generations, it's knowledge that kind of, in a way follows that scientific method, but obviously is not as linear, right? Because oftentimes when we look at science, we only focus on one question versus in Indigenous science, we tend to ask a more broader question because, it's knowledge that has been formulated through the generations. And I think that why I don't like to use the word traditional ecological knowledge, and oftentimes that's case by case, it's all dependent on what people prefer. But for me, when we talk about traditional ecological knowledge in the environmental sciences, it's always been coined in the past tense as something that's no longer existent or something that hasn't adapted. And I think that one of the, strongest push that I have is that our indigenous knowledges have adapted, especially to climate change through all these changes that we have experienced. And I think that that's what makes it more of a science. And I think it's just that word traditional, ecological, the traditional word that makes me favor the word indigenous science over that one.
Well, you made the point very clear throughout your writing that often the indigenous communities, indigenous peoples are treated as if they're in the past. Either they've been completely displaced, and then what remains has been put in a museum as if those people don't still exist. And I think the idea behind using the phrase indigenous science really does begin to reframe the whole idea of how do we work within our environments. And just a follow-up, because this made me actually laugh out loud, and you can tell me if that was your intention for this to be that kind of sarcastic almost response, but the quote is, "In Western academia, if you study biology and then integrate ecology, you're considered interdisciplinary." And I thought this was really funny because of how on point it is. Obviously, to the average person, if you ask them biology and ecology, those aren't separate disciplines. You instead, in Fresh Banana Leaves, the book you just published, this idea of a holistic viewpoint that does not divide up people and the environment really at all, but centers the connections between everything and everyone. So what do you see as the impact of this reframing when it comes to scientific practice?
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I wrote that is that oftentimes, when we talk to other scientists, especially environmental scientists, they like to call themselves interdisciplinary. And when you get to ask them, what makes your field or your study interdisciplinary, they will tell you, well, I study marine ecology, but I also study the biology of fishes or something, which, sometimes can, when you look at how they view that, right, it's interesting because these are well-established scientists who have that name recognition, especially in their fields. And I think that it wasn't to be sarcastic, but I guess it comes off sarcastic, right? Because if you understand how, as you were pointing out, that sometimes, it's easy to find the connections between ecology and biology. And that, there are younger scientists who are kind of moving against, that whole reality that's separate. I think that with indigenous science, it allows us to see overall the bigger picture, right? It allows us to see beyond the ecology and the biology. It makes us understand that, ecology and biology are interconnected to ourselves, are interconnected to health, are interconnected in many different ways. And I think that you bring up a great point, right, on how in the Western sciences we have placed things in boxes, but in reality with indigenous science, those boxes don't exist. It's a more holistic system if we were to talk about boxes and systems like, we talk in the Western sciences.
Absolutely. Daniel and I have had many conversations about this because he's got a PhD in the sciences and I recently finished my master's degree in community music. So academics from very different worlds, and a big focus of my program was interdisciplinary conversations between the arts and other humanities and how we can integrate other humanities in the arts more collaboratively and cohesively. And every single academic discipline that we approach, they always look at us a little bit funny at the beginning. It was very, very interesting to hear you talking about that. And I know a lot of my colleagues in the sciences are like, okay, but we need to integrate the humanities and think about the impacts of what our scientific developments are doing. You've discussed in your book in really, really beautiful ways how a lot of academics and would-be allies need to decenter themselves and prioritize Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous governance. I appreciated the example you used of the professor who was like, oh, we need to create a marine protection area in this part of the West Coast. And the local Indigenous groups were like, actually no, because we have pre-existing arrangements here and we're already working on protecting this in our own way. And also you didn't ask. The frustration that engendered. I've seen similar situations. This idea of Western's epistemological superiority, if you will, is unfortunately also really rife in activist spaces, which I am sure you have encountered. We are a self-professed socialist organization, meaning we're building on revolutionary theories that were developed in Europe and Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries. My question is, how can we as revolutionary socialists contextualize our work and decenter ourselves, focusing instead on the context of the land we're on?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And first of all, congratulations on finishing your master's. I think that, it's a big accomplishment.
Thank you.
And I think that oftentimes, even the way that we have been taught in Western society is that we shouldn't, when we have something that we're passionate about, especially as you were mentioning, these social causes, or even in the sciences, right? We kind of adapt that persona that, whatever we're doing, it's kind of part of our identity. And I think that, that's great because it allows us to not decenter ourselves in certain areas where we shouldn't be decentering ourselves, like the sciences. But I think that, oftentimes, as you were mentioning, a lot of these theories come from Western Europe and are not really aligned with the indigenous values of the indigenous communities whose lands we're occupying or whose lands we're trying to lead these movements. And I think that it starts with willing to learn. And I think that oftentimes, that willingness to learn can be met with a lot of reception just because, when we critique something, we take it personal. And that goes back to, how we view ourselves, especially if we have adapted that persona, that identity, right, of what it means to be a radical activist or a scientist, right? And I think that, willing to learn and also willing to seek stories that are not the norm. In every movement or in every discourse, there is a norm, a narrative that has become the dominant narrative. And I think that it's important for us to ask ourselves who is not being heard or who doesn't have a seat at the table so that we can disrupt that norm. And I think that happens everywhere, even in radical spaces where there's a dominant narrative that has kind of taken over that discussion. And I think that, if we start questioning and making those reflections as well, it will allow us to kind of center the voices that are often left out of the discourse. And I think, it comes with willing to learn and also willing to be uncomfortable, right? Because, we are going to take certain things personal. But I think that, when we start reflecting, it allows us to decenter ourselves and avoid taking things personal. That's my advice. But obviously, I'm willing to hear what you both have to say about that as well.
It's often very uncomfortable in activist spaces because everyone there is very well-meaning and people are there because they want to help, and being confronted with the idea that they're actually doing harm is often a really fraught conversation to navigate. The ego death necessary for decentering this Western European theoretical perspective is, I think, really, really important for us, especially white activists, to keep at the forefront.
And I'm sure maybe this is a conversation, Jessica, that you've had come up. You've addressed it specifically in your book, but I've seen it play out where there are people that can describe themselves as progressive, left, socialist, whatever term they want to call themselves, but they take umbrage, they get offended by being called a settler. Yet in your book, you break it down in not such a normative way. And from what I understand, you don't use the term settler to be a all disparaging term, but instead to, again, provide that context for how the work ought to be done. So maybe for all of our listeners, just break down what I thought was a very interesting way of viewing one person in relationship to the environment. You're either indigenous, you're a welcome guest, or you're an unwelcome guest, or you're a settler. And maybe just expand on that idea.
Yeah, I think that goes back to teaching my grandmother instilled in me. At a young age, I knew that I was displaced. I knew that I wasn't necessarily in my ancestral land. It's a privilege and a curse as well, right? Because my parents were the only ones displaced from their communities, from their families. So whenever we will talk about going back home, we will go back to our ancestral lands. And as a result of that, my grandmother always told me that, anywhere I walked, especially as a displaced indigenous girl at that time, right? And obviously I have grown up since, I will be an unwelcome guest. And that's because, I was going to be in someone's home. But, I'm still indigenous to the Americas, but I wasn't going to necessarily be at my home, right? And as a result of that, she always reminded me that I had to build relationships with not just the land, but the people, right? Because we look at landscapes as someone's home, right? And obviously, you're not going to welcome anybody into your home. You're going to have people coming into your home. Like we look at the metaphor of what a home is, right? That physical, building or whatever home you have. You're not going to welcome just anybody. You have to welcome guests, right? We welcome guests to our home. And I think that, that unwelcome guest is someone who is displaced and not necessarily has been welcomed by the community. And I think that, anywhere I go, I'm going to be an unwelcome guest. And it's my duty and responsibility to build those relationships with the people and the land that I'm currently displaced on so that the indigenous communities can welcome me into their home. And I think that, with the word settlers, right, it has become like that word that we don't like to mention because, it makes people uncomfortable. But I think with the word settlers, those who are settlers have to build that relationship to being a welcome guest and eventually a welcome guest. And oftentimes it's a lifelong journey. And, it's not up to me to determine who's a welcome guest because, unless I'm in my land. But it's ultimately the responsibility of the Indigenous communities. And I think that ties back to the critique that a lot of Indigenous peoples and scholars have with land acknowledgements, right? We're going to acknowledge the lands and the people, but when it comes to building those relationships with such land and people, we don't take action. And I think that, if you start doing that, you can move yourself from, obviously sometimes we inherited the roles of settler and we cannot dismantle that, right? And I think it's always up to the Indigenous communities to determine who is a welcome guest. So I hope that answered that question.
Oh, absolutely.
I was thinking throughout your book, I was at a talk with a Haudenosaunee elder. Haudenosaunee is one of the peoples whose lands I'm currently on. I'm kind of in the overlap between Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe lands. The elder was talking about the idea, he said, we are all indigenous to somewhere, by which he means go back in your ancestry and you'll find people who did have a deep connection to land and to place. You'll find people who were living in balance with the earth, who were trying to find ways of revering the earth and respecting the earth and being in relationship. He said, do your research, not only to the lands you're on now, but how your ancestry and your family lost their relationship with earth and with land. That's been something that's just been really, really important for me in my understanding of place as an immigrant to Canada. My parents are from the UK. And so I was just wondering, how does that fit into the context of being an unwelcome guest and learning about land and land-based practice?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful teaching that the elder shared with you. And I think that, it is true, right? If we look back at everyone's roots, we are indigenous to a certain place. And I think that oftentimes is because of these systems that have, for some reason, governed globally, like capitalism and, patriarchy, right? We have lost a sense to place, right? And when we look at where we see the history of the loss of indigeneity is because they targeted the woman in those cultures. And we're seeing that even parallel and reflect today, right? Because when we talk about environmental activism, when we talk about environmental justice, climate justice, especially in Latin America, where I can speak from, it's our indigenous women who are leading those movements, but it's also our indigenous women who are being impacted or who are facing violence. I often tell people that, the missing and murdered indigenous woman transcends across the United States. It goes across the Americas. And I think that, when we look at that relationships that even Europeans had, we look at the witch trials, right? It targeted women because, it's always women are at the core of our cultures. And I think that, that has resulted in many European descendants from losing their culture, losing that sense of place, right? Because they targeted the woman. And I think that, it's a great teaching to embody. And I think that it requires people to also ask what their intentions are also in seeking that ancestry, because oftentimes, if we don't have good intentions, it's not necessarily to do good, right? And I think that, when you have good intentions, you can align that to seeking, to searching more of your roots, and that what allows people to kind of reclaim those relationships with nature. And despite being displaced, right? Because I think as a displaced indigenous woman, I had to reclaim my relationships with nature because it wasn't the environment that, carried my ancestral histories. It was a different environment. I think that as a result of that, we learned how to better come in terms with building relationships with both the indigenous peoples and land. So yeah, thank you for sharing that teaching the elder shared with you.
The idea that the patriarchal oppression really does transcend different areas of the world because it was brought about as a dominant mode. And one point you make in the book very well is that there was a lot of knowledge, a lot of really developed science amongst indigenous people in the Americas that Western scientists are still struggling to try and understand today. Ideas of permaculture, ideas of architecture. You mentioned talking about some of these main systems of oppression, and you've mentioned a few from colonialism to capitalism, and you use a term throughout the book, eco-colonialism. And maybe we can open up the conversation a little bit about that. And then near the end, we can talk a little bit more about the struggle against this and how we need to situate ourselves in beginning to heal and undo the damage. So I want to share an example with you that came out of Canada. This past summer, record-breaking heat waves hit BC, and I think in the Pacific Northwest, it was probably quite similar. And in Canada, the epicenter was this small town in British Columbia called Lytton. It hit 50 degrees, which was an all-time record in Canada, and then the whole town burnt down within a few hours. So the province of BC warned the residents of Lytton, and they helped evacuate and whatnot. What they didn't do was warn or work with any of the nearby Indigenous communities. So I want to share a quote from Chief Matt Pascoe, who chairs the Inklahkapmo National Tribal Council. And this is his quote: "The root of the problem is not simply a failure to communicate, but what he alleged is a lack of respect for Indigenous governments and leaders." Does this example that I'm sharing, does that fit your description of eco-colonialism and the facets of eco-colonialism?
Thank you for sharing that example. And, it's kind of like tragic, right, to hear about those examples. And, unfortunately, they continue to happen. And yes, I would say that that is an example of eco-colonialism. And I know that, one of the beauties of terminology is that we can define it in different ways. And the way that I view eco-colonialism is the reality that non-Indigenous peoples are the ones making the policies, are making the decisions that govern our natural resources, that govern resource allocation, right? In this sense, it was the allocation of the resources to evacuate, to kind of persist or to make those decisions, right? In terms of how to come in realization with, the extreme heat wave. And I think that the fact that they forgot or, oftentimes didn't even think about including Indigenous peoples or to inform them of some of the solutions that they could help with kind of shows that eco-colonialism that continues to happen even today. And do you know how the tribe was impacted by the heat waves since they didn't evacuate?
They managed their own evacuation in the end, but they didn't have the assistance. So the impact was disproportionate then to the settler communities.
And we've seen that British Columbia, or so-called British Columbia, lots and lots of different Indigenous nations live out there, has had a really, really terrible year in terms of climate devastation. As I'm sure you are aware, you're not far away from there in Seattle. Just the way that resources have been allocated has been very transparently in favor. And also with the flooding that happened last year, we also saw the example of the RCMP, the National Police Force, being deployed against Indigenous land defenders in Wet'suwet'en territory, while communities were completely flooded out and had no road access and no resources and were running out of food. So it's very clear where these colonial governments were putting their priorities, which is very transparent eco-colonialism. Our last podcast guest, we were very, very privileged to talk to Teresa Tate-Day, who's a matriarch from Wet'suwet'en, and she was telling us about some groups like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which is a group dedicated to engaging dialogue and asserting self-determination regarding extractivist projects and infrastructure development. And they're heading up all kinds of really, really cool work. What do you think Indigenous-led resource development would look like?
Yeah, one of the examples that I can think of that kind of relates to this question of what Indigenous-led resource development looks like is just that when we plant something, right, and then we harvest it, we only take what we need. And oftentimes that kind of comes in tension with capitalism, right? Because with capitalism, we're trying to commodify to the best that we can to create a higher profit. And I think of the ways that we practice our agriculture back in my communities through the milpas. And the milpas are these holistic agricultural systems that have been passed down to us from our ancestors, where we don't necessarily need to do a lot of action to have them be sustainable because they sustain themselves. The only thing that we probably sometimes do is, remove some of the dead leaves or remove some of sometimes the small weeds that we use for our teas, but not to that extent where we have to do a lot of caretaking of it. And when we harvest the milpa, since it's a community joint event, instead of equally sharing everything, we share it in a way that if you have 4 people in your family, you get 4 corn. If you have 6 people in your family, you get 6 corn. And I think that, that comes in tension with capitalism because oftentimes, we have been taught that communism, right, which, I think that in this case is that relationship that we have with just taking what we need, it's going to be described as communism. it's kind of stopped, right? And I think that, indigenous-led resource allocation or development will look like something like that. But obviously, I don't know if these settler governments will ever accept that, just because, they're going to see it as communism, and they're going to use that to kind of, allow people to go against it, right? As, Canada and the United States are global leaders in terms of like stopping the spread of communism, right? Which I think, tying it back to fresh banana leaves, that was one of the reasons why my father and a lot of indigenous people had to fight in that Central American Civil War. It was because, they coined that as communism, even though, or it was a movement led by indigenous peoples against the oppressive systems that they wanted to go against.
It's something that we often refer to when we talk about the untenability, just the fact that any support for capitalism means supporting the subjugation of a certain group of people, because if you're not going to equally develop resources and share resources, you want to make profit, well, someone has to lose out in that equation. One thing that we do talk about, and this kind of gets to some earlier questions about the roots of socialist ideas coming mostly from Europe and Asia, but we use this term scientific socialism or dialectical materialism, looking at two different ways of thinking and trying to find the best way forward. And one idea that I draw on in my own writing is this idea of metabolic rift, where this is something that Marx talked about a long time ago. And I think it's also a bit embarrassing then for Western science that it took up until the 1800s for them to realize that nutrients that are taken from soil has to be returned to the same soil, otherwise it gets depleted. It was seen as like a huge academic achievement. So do you see any intersection then between the concept of scientific socialism and the ideas that emerge from the practice of indigenous science? Or do you see them maybe as distinct ideas that are coded in entirely different language?
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels. And thank you for sharing that example, because, we have been taught throughout the generations that when you pick up a plant, you kind of have to gift it with something. And usually it's like native plants to that area, right? And it's interesting because going to the environmental sciences, when we read those articles that kind of share the same knowledge, obviously they don't give credit to indigenous knowledge systems. They don't give credit to indigenous communities that have been practicing that since time immemorial. And I think that, it kind of is interesting because, there is a lot of parallels between what you mentioned, and also the way that indigenous communities live and continue to thrive even to this day. So thank you for sharing that example. That's great.
I've been really heartened. We've been talking a lot about things like important documents in the history of socialist thinking, like the transitional program and the legacies of the Bolsheviks and all that kind of thing. One of the really radical things that people really often overlook was one of the first things that was done in a lot of these revolutionary contexts was, first and foremost, return of control of the land. Land was returned to the control of indigenous people or oppressed people, people who lived on that land, even if they weren't necessarily supporters of the revolution, and then, maybe fought against the revolution. That was still a really important thing, and I think that's an important thing for any left-leaning organization. Is self-determination of oppressed peoples supersedes everything else, even when that comes into conflict with things in our own political ideology.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think it parallels when the Central American Civil War, right? Because it was a resistance to kind of regain that stewardship of the land, this land that was sold to large international agricultural corporations that introduced plantations, from bananas to pineapples to avocados. And through those land grabs, right, they started using indigenous peoples as low wage, right, where, you were paid 2 pennies to do really hard labor because they needed somebody to harvest these monocultural agricultural systems. And I think that, it parallels very similar to that, right, because their whole mission was to kind of regain that land and also give it away to each family. It wasn't to, to have a dictator. It wasn't to have, one person own the entire land. It was to give it back to the people who were storing those lands. And I think that this whole concept of ownership, right, it also kind of goes against, a lot of socialism, because, socialism is we all own the land, or we all steward it, right? But then in capitalism, it's one person or one government owns the land. There's this ownership of the land, and it's interesting to see that parallel as well.
talking about the political context, and you talk about this a lot in your book, especially what your father went through in El Salvador and then coming to Mexico. Given that capitalism is this driving force of violence and displacement and general awfulness in Latin America and Central America, what political alternatives are being advocated for by marginalized communities? And what alternatives are being pushed for or have been pushed for in the past?
Yeah, if we were to coin it with a Western term, it would probably be socialism, right? Where the community has been trying to take back their land through the land back movement, right? That transcends across the Americas and sometimes transcends globally. And I think through that, sometimes because, like we were mentioning before, it can be coined as something as communism, right? All these countries go against it and they provide the army or the government with support to, kind of stop the rebels, right, that are trying to spread communism. And oftentimes, it might not be communism. It might just be the fact that, people want to break systems of oppression that continue to marginalize them, as you were mentioning. And I think that oftentimes, because of that, sometimes we have to work within the systems. We're seeing in Latin America how there has been, more indigenous representation in the presidential campaigns. And I think that sometimes it's hard, right, to try to go against a government system that it's globally, right? It's a global dominant, especially in terms of capitalism, democracy, because, the world leaders, right, when we talk about Europe, the United States, Canada, they follow these ideologies. So sometimes for Indigenous peoples, the best way to do that is to work through the system. But, in the most positive way, we will have back our land. We will be living in relation with the land, not in a way that we owned it, not in a way that we're trying to make the most profit out of it, but in a way that we're healing, especially since some of the impacts of climate change cannot be reversed, right? We kind of have to adapt to those impacts because, our governments haven't taken actions for generations.
And especially with the incredible violence that activists face, there is a certain amount of you need to protect yourself, protect your families while still fighting for the cause. So of course that definitely shapes things a little bit differently than it does here, where we don't face, as activists in Canada, we don't face the same kinds of oppression and violence that activists and Indigenous peoples in Central America do.
I wanted to follow up on this to hone in on a specific example you share in Fresh Banana Leaves, the Zapatista movement. What lessons ought we draw from this? And even if you want to give a bit of a background for the people listening to this who don't know of this struggle, what was it? Who was leading it? What do we learn from it? What should we learn from it?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up because I think that also answers the question Emily asked. The Zapatistas movement was actually a movement led by Indigenous women. And then it goes back to the patriarchy, right? When we look at the Zapatistas, it was Comandante Marcos, who's a cisgender man, who became the face of that movement. But the Zapatista movement was just an act of resistance where Indigenous peoples were tired, waiting for the government to take action to protect them, waiting for the government to provide them with resources whenever they needed them. So what they did is that they took over a city in Chiapas, and as a result, they reclaimed their lands. They had weapons. There wasn't that much violence because, of the numbers and the numbers of supports that they were able to gain. The Mexican government kind of backed out. They didn't actually meet them with violence. And as a result of that, in Chiapas, the Zapatista community, which is made up of several indigenous Maya pueblos of that area, they are the ones leading their government structures. They're the ones who have people determining what kind of steps or solutions their communities or nation, because, they're made up of different tribes, are going to take. And I think that with the Zapatista movement, it also shows and highlights how it's a lot of women and Indigenous women who have the solutions to oppressive government system. But as a result of that, we are seeing either their erasure, right, their silencing of their voices, because when we look at the Zapatistas, I think it was until 2012 when a book came out that actually highlighted the Indigenous women in this movement. They're not highlighted, right? They tend to focus on the men, or, that's why they continue to face extreme violence, right? Like we have many Indigenous environmental leaders who are murdered in Latin America, disappear or go missing because the government knows that if Indigenous women are leading something, they can lead to solutions like the Zapatistas actually took to reclaim their lands. and to govern their environments, their educational system, like their children are being taught their native languages because, we also see that language loss in our communities. And I think that's a beautiful movement, and it has inspired many Indigenous communities across the globe to kind of do that. But when it comes to, what kind of Indigenous environmental movements, we know the Zapatistas are kind of missing from the discourse, even though they're one of the first successful Indigenous nations that kind of took that self-sovereignty, that Indigenous determination to reclaim their lands and govern themselves in their proper cultural protocol.
Amazing. And it's interesting. I haven't done a lot of extensive research into the Zapatistas. It's been kind of something I've been chipping away at. But as you say, in everything I've seen about the Zapatistas and videos about them and articles I've read, it really does not talk very much about the leadership role that women took and really kind of minimizing the critical role that they played in the leadership and the conception of the movement as a whole.
So I want to ask a follow-up question, and I'm going to read a brief passage from your book, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. For me personally, in order to defeat the eco-wars as Indigenous people, we must become a solidified nation, which means that intertribal and pueblo relationships must be fortified. However, we must understand that we are going against a giant system, settler colonialism, and we need folks who will be willing to give up the power and privilege they are granted within the system based solely on their race or socioeconomic status in order for us to truly reach environmental justice and end the eco-wars. So you highlighted this necessity for Indigenous peoples and settlers to present what we would call in socialist language a united front in the struggle for self-determination for all peoples, particularly oppressed peoples, and for justice. I want you maybe to expand on this. And also, do you see the seeds for this anywhere today in the Americas? Do you see the first steps being taken towards such solidarity, or is that work that still needs to be done?
Yeah, thank you for reading that passage. I think that the reason why it's important, and I think it starts with intertribal relationships, right? Because oftentimes, even within tribes and pueblos, we have conflicts. And I think that one of the conflicts that oftentimes I forget to mention is that during the Central American Civil War or during this migration movement where a lot of Central Americans are being displaced, there is a lot of xenophobia among Indigenous communities where not every Indigenous pueblo or nation actually gives them refuge. And I think that oftentimes I forget that it was a privilege for my father to have received refuge and asylum from my maternal mom's pueblo because, that's not the case. And as a result of that, because the Zapotec nations were made up of different pueblos as well, there's a lot of pueblos that don't necessarily come in relation with my pueblo because, they go against this notion of like, oh, you're letting immigrants come in. And it's kind of that domino effect, right, that we see throughout the Americas where even in Central America, right, there's xenophobia against people from South America. And I think that, that's the first step. And I think that before we start doing that work, right, we shouldn't call on allies sometimes because, we haven't solidified our front ourselves, even across settler borders. Sometimes there's not that intertribal relationship that should be happening between First Nations in Canada, Native Americans in the United States, and Indigenous peoples in, Mexico and Latin America. But I think that, it's important that we do have allies who are willing to give up their power, especially the power that's granted through several privileges. And obviously that's through the systems that are in place. And, hopefully we do start seeing that. I mean, we have started seeing people being allies to Indigenous communities, but the numbers are so few that it hasn't really created this large ripple effect. I mean, obviously it's planting seeds, but it hasn't become a ripple effect. And hopefully, it's our generation and the future generations that we start seeing that more of that solidarity. Because, we're still being governed by politicians who still have conservative values that do not align or support Indigenous communities as a whole.
Kind of jumping off of that, because of the recent discoveries made at the residential schools in Canada, the discovery of the unmarked graves has really catapulted indigeneity and Indigenous issues into the spotlight of Canadian discourse. But that also laser focuses into the Canadian context, and a lot of the times we forget about the very, very different contexts elsewhere. I mean, I was really struck, I didn't know until I read your book that there was no treaties governing Indigenous and settler relationships in Central and Latin America. And so, the ways that the Indigenous struggles have looked very different, and the struggle for self-determination has looked very different in those contexts. So, we really arbitrarily limit our discussion of Indigenous struggles to Indigenous people in Canada and the United States. But what are some of the struggles in Central America that we ought to know about and support? You talk a lot about mutual aid. What mutual aid projects should we be engaging in?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that that's a discourse that we come in tension sometimes, right? Because I think that even when we look at colonization, even the year 1492, Christopher Columbus didn't land in the United States or Canada first. He landed in the Caribbean. So as a result, we saw colonization kind of impact South America, Latin America first. And that's why, oftentimes we didn't have treaties, right? Because we had a different wave of colonization that is different, that looks different from the United States and Canada. And I think that as a result of that, right, that's the first way that we ignore Indigenous communities from Latin America, by not acknowledging that colonization that 1492 happened in the Caribbean, which is part of Latin America. Going back to the question Danielle had, we have to build those intertribal relationships where we're also uplifting other voices that Indigenous peoples, especially south of the border, are also facing. And obviously in a respectful way, right? Especially for those of us who are displaced, we have to do it in a respectful way. And I think some of the movements that even have happened today is in the Maya Quechua community of Guatemala. And, we were able to lead a mutual aid with that alongside the International Mayan League. They were fighting against a mining company that was poisoning their waters and soils. And, fortunately for us, because there was that, solidarity across settler borders, it received media attention to the point that you saw that it was our Indigenous women elders, our matriarchs, who were in the front lines being thrown tear gas, right? Or being thrown those bombs of tear gas. And I think that it was the way that the media was able to portray it, it erased that Indigenous women were the ones leading that movement. It was Indigenous women who were tired of their waters being poisoned and the government, ignoring them because obviously they're going to prioritize the mining company, right? Which I think has some ties to Canada. I don't really understand fully the connections, but it has ties to Canada as well.
We wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, most of the mining comes from Canada.
So much.
That's an example, right, of like some of the ways that we can support one another is to uplift those movements that don't necessarily get media attention and to uplift them in a way that they're told by the Indigenous peoples. And I think an example that ties back to immigration or displacement is because of the poisoning of the water, the ongoing climate change impacts, the ongoing violence that Indigenous peoples face, that we're seeing those caravans of Central Americans, mostly Indigenous peoples, being forced to flee their countries. And then what the United States does is that it criminalizes immigration. It has put our children in cages. And I sometimes kind of make the similarities of, boarding schools, right? Because it's our children are being separated from their parents and put in cages where we are having children pass holidays, be alone, feel like they have been abandoned by their parents, but it's because they were taken away from their parents' arms. And unfortunately, because of that language disparity, right? Because not every Indigenous person from Latin America speaks Spanish. We are losing a lot of our Indigenous children to preventable deaths. I think that, we had the 3rd-year death anniversary of Jacqueline Cal, a 7-year-old Maya Quechua girl who died under U.S. custody because her father was forced to sign a paper in Spanish. And obviously he didn't know how to read Spanish or English. And he wasn't provided the translation services to advocate for his daughter's health. And I think that, it ties back to her Maya Quechua community continuing to fight. But sometimes that fight, because we don't have the resources to lead that fight to the way that we can be successful, is forcing our people to be displaced. But Canada and the United States, again, criminalizes immigration, especially, immigration that comes from south of the border.
Yeah, it's something that we try our best to highlight here. One, on the Canadian mining companies, it's a stat that we like to highlight, but 75% of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada because the regulations here are the most lax. You're allowed to trade on the Toronto Stock Exchange with fewer protections in place and regulations in place than in other countries. We've had previous episodes talking about Canadian mining companies taking advantage of genocide in Ethiopia. And we've highlighted it within Canada, and it's everywhere. And we need to highlight that because it chips away at that idea of Canadian superiority and nationalism. I think if that story was very widespread, how would you be proud to be Canadian if you knew that that was ongoing and it's being done in your name? We will do a quick shout out then. There's a website, Canadian Mining Watch, and they publish articles and exposés on the atrocities committed by Canadian mining companies abroad. And most of the time, it's either Africa, South America, or Central America. I just want to ask then more directly to the question of mutual aid. We tried to the best of our ability with this podcast to share the links to different mutual aid projects that people can directly support. If someone's listening to this and they're wondering, where can I help in a financial way? So if you know of any mutual aid projects that you endorse that you think are important, you can share them now, or even if you remember them later, send us an email. We'll make sure that it's included in the text of the podcast. But for example, I did see one on Twitter. People are raising money collectively to be able to purchase copies of your book so that younger Indigenous people can actually read your story that centers the Indigenous experience in science.
Thank you for highlighting that one. And I think that, oftentimes our Black and Indigenous youth don't have the resources, right, to purchase a book. And I want to make it accessible, but, I also have limitations. But I think the ones that I do want to highlight is the International Mayan League, their Indigenous Solidarity Fund. And with that Indigenous Solidarity Fund, what we do, because I'm also a part of the volunteer organization, the volunteer aspect of the organizations, is that we try to address immigration more holistically, where we're trying to uplift Indigenous voices within the immigration discourse, where we're trying to bring justice to the Indigenous children's death that we have experienced, like, Jacqueline Cal, who was the young girl whose name I mentioned. And I think through that, we're also trying to highlight the climate injustices and how immigration, especially the forced displacement of Indigenous peoples from Latin America, is a climate justice issue. And I think that, oftentimes, and thank you for bringing up mutual aids, when we talk about organizations that are Indigenous-led, it goes back to that resource allocation, right? Where we don't receive the funds, we don't receive the resources to do the work that we have to do for our communities. So that's an organization that was also featured in the book, especially Juanita Cabrera, the executive director, whose relatives kind of founded this organization that helps both displaced Indigenous Maya people and Indigenous Maya people back in our homelands. And I think that one of the mutual aids that we led was to support the Maya Quechí community, especially as we were trying to uplift their stories, to support the Prensa Comunitaria, which is an Indigenous Maya Quechí-led journalism, small organization, to uplift those stories. And, thanks to being able to support that, they were able to uplift their stories. And hopefully Canada also received the news of what was happening in Maya Quechí community in Guatemala.
One of the things that you really highlight is how critically important it is to understand land and have relationships with the land, and kind of centering that in your activism and research and just day-to-day life, and emphasizing how capitalism has really broken our relationships to land and how difficult it is to maintain a relationship to land, especially in urban spaces. And so how can we, especially those of us who are primarily based in urban centers, develop more tangible connections to land and place? And then how do we use that to inform our work and inform our advocacy?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think one of the first steps is to acknowledge that even cities are Indigenous lands, because oftentimes, even in Seattle, we tend to erase that these are Duwamish lands, right? And the Duwamish tribe is still trying to seek federal recognition. And I think that, that's been stopped because their lands are Seattle. So, obviously the government doesn't want to give up Seattle or any lands here. And I think that the second step is just to, find urban parks, also find Indigenous communities, urban Indigenous communities, assist them in their efforts, because they're always trying to, they probably have a lot of efforts that they're leading on the ground that relate back to our environments, that relate back to our lands. And I think, it's just like you were mentioning, Emily, the teaching that the elder kind of shared with you is kind of reclaiming those roots, those ancestral roots that many people have lost, so that we can better understand Indigenous communities of the lands we're currently occupying or settled in. And I think that, that's the first way to do that. And sometimes access to even green spaces is not, accessible to everyone, especially in cities. You have to drive a long way to, be in a national park. But also, understanding the history of the places where we currently live in, and seeing how we can better build relationships and kinships with the Indigenous peoples and the land. Because I think that, like we were discussing, we tend to erase the connection between people and the lands. And I think that, building the relationship with Indigenous peoples whose lands we're occupying kind of, parallels the relationship that we're building with the lands that we're currently occupying, or the environment.
If there's anything that we didn't ask you about that you feel you really would like to share, you can take as much time as you want to highlight, say, repeat anything you want.
No, just thank you for having me. And I think, these were all insightful questions, and I really enjoyed the conversation we just had. So thank you again for hosting me.
Oh, our
thank
privilege.
You. This is
our honor. Thank you once again for tuning in to the Red Review, brought to you by Socialist Action. Thank you to Jessica for coming onto the show and sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you, the listener, for your support throughout our first year in the biz, so to speak. In the meantime, stay safe, stay active, and we'll see you first week of March when we release what are going to now be seasonal reviews. We'll be providing our take on December, January, and February, assuming we make it that far.